Beautiful by Roseann Ezra Prologue. They were finally divorced. Dinah gave a huge silent scream of thankfulness the moment the judge approved their paperwork. She felt a huge weight being lifted from her shoulders as she turned to hug the gangly youngster who sat patiently next to a smiling suit-attired woman with stunning emerald green eyes. No more bickering, no more being smacked around, and no more having to endure insult upon insult. It was all thankfully over. Bo has invited us for a final goodbye visit to the diner, Lauren. Don't you want to come along? Dinah smiled warmly at her best friend. Unfortunately, I can't. I have a patient coming through in an hour's time, but you as a family should go. It will give you some closure, Lauren advised before scurrying away. The drive was hot and dusty, and getting hotter by the minute as Dinah watched Bo consume beer after beer. She met the eyes of the fearful girl who sat silently in the back seat. Why don't you just let us off at the next filling station, Bo? Dinah urged as they weaved from left to right as Bo tried to reach for the can that had fallen to the floor. Always nagging, aren't you? Don't you ever shut up? He screamed at her in frustration. Watch out! Screamed the petrified voice of the child as they smashed into the huge tree that sat at the curve of the road. She watched as her dad was thrown about like a rag doll before slamming into the battered figure of her mother, who gazed at her through sightless eyes. Anguished screams rent the air before giving way to silence. Lauren allowed the phone to drop through the nerveless hands before collapsing into her chair. She sobbed uncontrollably. If only she had gone along, then maybe, just maybe. Beautiful by Roseann Ezra. Chapter 1. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. The music began to throb over the group of people who were swaying to its beat. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and intrigue. All around were laughing faces and expectant partners, though not for everyone present. Lauren stood on the edge of the staircase. She had come for one purpose, and that was to catch a glimpse of the man that had almost single-handedly destroyed the life of the young child called Brett, who was now, as a result of this man's actions, an orphan at the tender age of 14. Together with their parents, they had been a close and loving family until the formidable Chase Richards had stepped into the picture, a man so powerful that he always got what he wanted, no matter what the cost. Bo and Dinah had owned the diner, which was situated in the most beautiful part of Salt Rock in KwaZulu-Natal. Charmingly nestled into the hills and overlooking the sea, this was indeed the most coveted place along the coastlines. It had been a thriving success, until all the surrounding land had been bought by a mysterious developer. Sad to say, the business began to suffer, and this began to put an immense strain on their relationship. Barely 2 months later, after this troubling occurrence, they had separated. Dinah moved back to her parents' home with Brett. It seemed as if Bo had lost all hope in everything and turned and lost himself in the comfort of the bottle. The last time that Lauren had seen them together as a family was at the final signing of their divorce papers. They had gone for a final glimpse of their diner, which was in the process of being sold, when Bo lost control of their Land Cruiser and had slammed right into a tree. Dinah and Bo had been instantly killed, but Brett had been more fortunate. She had been flung to the ground during the crash, but had sadly lost all feelings in her legs. She was, therefore, confined to a wheelchair at such a tender age, and it seemed as if all her joy had disappeared. It was common knowledge, as well as documented, that if anything happened to Bo and Dinah, their best friend Lauren would become legal guardian to avoid family conflict. 1 year later, Lauren was still trying to adapt to the life of a single mother. Brett, who was now 15, proved to be incredibly strong and mature for her age. Shying away from attention, she was extremely withdrawn from everyone except Lauren and Maggie, her helper. Tonight she was with Maggie, as Lauren had some unfinished business to take care of. Dressed in an eye-catching creation in the color jade, with her lovely long red hair falling softly down her back, Lauren was unaware of the breathtaking picture she presented. Her emerald green eyes swept silently over the throng of people until it finally rested on Chase Richards himself. Devastatingly handsome in an expensively tailored suit, with his jet black hair curling softly over the collar of his jacket, he was certainly an eye candy. As if aware of the close scrutiny he was being subjected to, he turned, and Lauren suddenly found herself gripped in a gaze of piercing green eyes. A peculiar feeling stirred deep within her chest as she was drawn into the very depth of his eyes. She suddenly realized that she was staring and turned away in embarrassment on the pretense of searching for something to drink. It was then that she realized that this man was more dangerous than what she had initially thought, and that she needed to be on her guard, or else she would be lost to his charm. Lost in her thoughts whilst she sipped on a glass of sparkling water, her senses immediately reacted to the threat of danger. Lauren knew immediately that he was standing behind her. Willing herself to turn around, she found herself gazing up into a beautifully tanned face. Chase could hardly believe that he had actually followed this lovely image all the way across the room. He just knew with a certainty that she was someone he needed to meet and get to know. "May I have this dance?" he asked, holding out his hand to hers. Before she could respond, He captured her hand in his and quickly twirled her across the floor. Lauren was impressed by his superb dance skill and furious at his assumption that she would have agreed to his invitation. Just what do you think you were doing?" she demanded, tilting her head back and staring up at him through blazing eyes. "I don't recall accepting your invitation, and I would prefer it if you would immediately stop." "No, I like having you here in my arms, so actually, I do mind," Chase drawled. "I'm Chase Richards, by the way, and I'm the host of this party. The good Lord must be smiling down on me, because I certainly don't recall ever having seen you before. Are you sure that you were included on the guest list?" "I guess it's a bit too late to be checking now," he chuckled. "Though I'm sure I would have remembered someone like you," he continued. "And what exactly do you mean by someone like me?" hissed Lauren, squirming in his arms as she tried to break free. "How can you possibly know anything about me?" "Well," Chase laughed, "I guess that you're what every Christian mother would describe as a temptation. I guess they knew what they were talking about, especially with that figure and blazing hair that one could lose his hands in, not to mention his head. Yep, definitely a temptation," he sighed dramatically. "It's a good thing that I'm a church-going boy, and I've been taught how to fend off the wiles of a seductress," he said, solemn-faced. "That is enough, you insufferable man, you. You know absolutely nothing about me. And now that I've met you, I thank God that I would never have to stomach your presence in the near future." She lashed out furiously, wrenching herself from his grip. As she suddenly became aware of the many eyes that were openly staring at them, a shuttered look closed over her face. And smiling politely, she thanked him for the dance. Pivoting perfectly on her incredibly high heels, she deliberately exaggerated the sway of her hips as she glided through the curious onlookers and out into the foyer. It was only once she was in the safety of the empty room did she allow herself to exhale. Relaxing her face into a smile, she approached the doorman for her velvet wrap. In one fluid flick of her wrists, she draped it over her shoulders. Stepping towards the rotating doors, she stopped in mid-stride as she caught sight of him, propped against one of the outside pillars, studiously watching her. Whoever goes hunting for what is right and kind finds life itself, glorious life. Chase was not quite certain as to why he had followed her. Maybe it was because he didn't know her name, or, if truth be told, she intrigued him with her confidence and her quiet poise. No one had ever dared to stand up to him, and yet she had done it so effortlessly. He was impressed. "Are you waiting for your car to be brought around, or can I give you a ride home?" he asked gently. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I was just about to call for a taxi," answered Lauren politely. "No, you won't," said Chase. "I'll drive you. Consider it my way of apologizing for my rude behavior earlier on." Lightly grasping her elbow, He led her to a sleek black Audi Turbo that was parked in the courtyard. Being the gentleman he was raised to be, he opened the door and strapped her in, making her alarmingly conscious of his masculinity. Chase grinned cheerfully into her astonished face, as if in tune to her emotions. He walked unhurriedly around the car and slid in. The car purred to life at his touch, and with a skilled hand he eased out of the parking area and onto the road. There was a deadly silence, except for the need to give directions. Lauren was not sure just how to react to the situation. Why was he driving her home when he had a house full of people to entertain? Surely somebody was going to notice his absence. It all just didn't make any sense as to why he would even bother. No one questions my actions or decisions. Chase's voice broke the silence, startling her. The party will still carry on, whether I am there or not, thanks to my wonderful mother, who also happens to be the hostess. Your mother? She gasped. This was getting very confusing really fast. Here was the most illegible bachelor in town, and he was living with his mother. She laughed at the look of total bewilderment on her face. Oh gosh, no. It is so not what you are thinking. I do not live with my mom. She has her own home just up the road from me, so I can still ensure that she's okay without being obtrusive. Why I feel the need to explain myself is beyond me when I don't even know your name. I could just continue to call you sweetheart, he said softly. Angry at the way he was able to read her mind and thoughts, she blurted out quickly, Lauren, my name is Aaryan and Aayden. Turning to look at her through amused eyes, he said, You have a lovely name, Aaryan and Aayden, but I still prefer sweetheart. And on the subject of all things beautiful, your home is equally lovely. Lauren jerked upright and turned to gaze out the window, only to realize that they were parked outside her home. Deep stains of crimson crept over her cheeks as she fumbled with the door catch and hastily climbed outside. Quickly trying to regain her composure, she thanked him in a stilted voice. Just as she hurriedly tried to make her escape, the front door opened and Maggie ran out. Laurie, come quickly. Brett tried to get out of bed and she fell. Maggie had barely finished what she was saying when Lauren dashed past her and disappeared into the house. Kicking off her shoes in the doorway, she raced upstairs and straight into Brett's bedroom. Propped high against a pile of pillows lay the tear-streaked face of Brett. When she saw Lauren, she let out a sob and held out her arms. Climbing onto the bed, Lauren gently took her into her arms and rocked her until her sobs subsided. The door opened and both Maggie and Chase walked in. Maggie began to hurriedly explain what had happened, clearly unaware of the tension that filled the room. Lauren and Chase stared at each other. And finally Maggie broke off what she was saying in mid-sentence as she realized that neither one of them was listening to her. Glancing at them curiously, she hastily exited the room. Blessed are those whose strength is in you. Psalms chapter 84, verse 5. Brett had finally fallen asleep in Lauren's arms, and carefully she laid her down and gently tucked her in. Rising slowly to her feet after softly kissing Brett's pale, tear-streaked face, she suddenly turned towards Chase. Being conscious of his presence and aware that he had watched her every action, she was surprised by an odd, almost tender expression playing on his face before a blank look masked his face. Tiptoeing out of the room, she led the way downstairs and into the lounge. Feeling an overwhelming tiredness creep over her, she sank into the nearest seat and buried her face in her hands and offered a prayer of thankfulness, not quite caring what she thought of her gratitude to her awesome God. Chase had remained silent through the entire time, and she was surprised when his voice joined hers in agreement to her prayer. Moving to stand directly behind her, he placed his hands on her shoulders and began to gently massage her tense muscles, which had tightened even further at his touch. His silence and the gentle pressure of his soothing hands seemed to comfort and relax her until the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the pleasantness. Smiling at the frown that marred her face, he reached over and snagged the offending instrument before she could. "Dr. Danae!" screeched an anxious-sounding voice. Slowly handed her the receiver and moved to gaze out the window that was situated across the room. It was obvious that she needed her space. A doctor? This woman was becoming more and more of a puzzle. Hearing the click of the handset being placed down, he turned from his view of the sparkling pool and faced her with a questioning look on his face. "Is everything all right?" "Why don't I ask that dear sweet lady to make us a cup of tea? You look like you could really do with a sweet cup right about now." Chase smiled, striding out of the room. Lauren leaned back against the cushions, exhaustion washing over her as she closed her eyes and calmed her mind. "Dear God, thank you for your tender mercy over Brett. Please watch over her and let your peace flood her soul. Give her the joy she so deserves, and let her know that she is truly loved. Fill me with your strength as I seek to honor your glory." The sound of the tea trolley being wheeled in was what broke into the concentration of her communication with God. She watched as Chase prepared her a cup of chamomile tea and brought it over. Picking it up, she inhaled the faint apple spice that fragranced the tea. It smelled heavenly. "What do you specialize in?" asked Chase, breaking into her moment of utter enjoyment. "I'm a psychiatrist. I guess my path was chosen a long time ago. My dad was one. And I think my passion came from watching the way he connected with people, especially children. He had the ability to make anyone open up to him and completely put their trust in him. He said that it was a calling. He made it abundantly clear that his way of treating anyone would always involve prayer and God. He founded the Lorden Center, which is where I work. When my parents were killed in a freak storm, it seemed natural for me to step in and continue his work with children, especially the abandoned, abused children. She smiled. What about Brett's dad? Probed Chase. I'm not married, if that is what you want to know. I think I should call it a night. I am utterly exhausted, and I have a full day ahead of me tomorrow. She sighed, smothering a yawn in the process. Studying her intently, he realized that she indeed looked tired and strained. Without any hesitation, he bid her good night and stood to leave. Lauren walked him to the door. Rising on tiptoe, she swiftly pecked him on the cheek. Thank you, Chase, for everything. In the moonlight, she looked even more beautiful. Taking her hands in his, he gently placed a feather-soft kiss on each of them and then stepped out towards his car and drove off without even so much as glancing back. Beautiful by Roseann Ezra. Chapter 2. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Psalms chapter 91, verse 1 and 2. A week had already passed since her first encounter with the great Chase Richards, and Lauren was still unsure of what to make of him, which was surprising considering that character analysis was part of her job. What was even more surprising was the way her thoughts strayed towards him incessantly. She knew then that she would never meet anyone quite like him. Shrugging aside the image that filled her mind, she reached across her desk and picked up one of the folders that lay stacked there. Within minutes, she immersed herself in the contents thereof. Chase was experiencing exactly the same problem. Lauren had firmly rooted herself in his mind, and he could not keep his thoughts from straying towards her. Her image seemed almost imprinted in his head. The way she smiled, the intensity of her gaze, and especially the softness of her lips on his cheek. Automatically, his hand reached up and he touched the spot of that gentle kiss. Fighting the urge to call her, he turned his attention to the more pressing problems at hand. He was running late on his schedule and still needed to attend a meeting with his lawyer Grant, who was also experiencing nightmares of his own. They were both searching desperately for the previous owners of a small diner that he was in the process of acquiring. There was a matter of paperwork that needed to be finalized and payments that needed to be made to them, but it seemed as if they had disappeared from the face of the planet. This was their third attempt at trying to set up a meeting, and it wasn't looking very promising. Their only success was in the fact that Grant had been able to set up a luncheon with somebody who could locate the previous owners and he was adamant on attending. Striding out of the office, he paused at the desk of his long-standing secretary and quickly filled her in on the events for the rest of the day before stepping into the waiting elevator. Lauren had just fetched Brett from school and was on her way to this luncheon meeting. She prayed that it would not upset Brett, who was slowly starting to adjust to her new life. She could not understand the urgency or the vagueness of the meeting as conveyed by Grant, the gentleman she was meeting. In his feeble attempt at an explanation, it was this that prompted her to attend, and in any case, at least they would be lunching at one of the finest restaurants in town. Realizing that she was now running late, she was fortunate enough to find a parking space just in front of the entrance. She quickly signaled to the doorman for assistance. Together, they were able to quickly settle Brett into a lightweight wheelchair of the very latest design. With a quick wave and thankful smile to the doorman, they entered the foyer. Their progress was slow as young Brett negotiated the very limited space automatically. Grant stifled a smile at Chase's muttered expression of irritation. His curiosity quickened as he observed the way Chase's expression stilled and the manner in which he straightened from his frustrated posture. He followed the direction of the gaze of his now attentive friend and let out a soft whistle at the beauty that was walking their way. Chase had been growing increasingly annoyed at the tardiness of their guest and was staring impatiently at the entrance when suddenly his attention was riveted on the woman that entered. He knew that it was Lauren without even glancing at her face. But what was even more fascinating was the fact that she was walking towards their table. Lauren started in surprise as the waiter came to an abrupt halt and heard Brett giggle as she bumped right into his back. She laughingly apologized to him and suddenly froze as she found herself staring into a pair of familiar eyes. She immediately masked her expression into what Brett called her professional face. A feeling of dread settled at the pit of her stomach as she realized the significance of the meeting. Where there is strife, there is pride, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. Proverbs 13, verse 10. Both gentlemen immediately stood up as the waiter ushered Lauren to his seat and assisted Brett in the space that he had created by removing the existing chair. Grant quickly introduced himself and then turned towards the very silent Chase, who also hurriedly smiled a greeting before turning to engage Brett in conversation. It was obvious that Brett seemed to have a vague recollection of him, in that she was utterly relaxed in his gentle banter, which was indeed surprising, considering that she normally shied away from strangers. Not wanting to break this instant rapport between Chase and her daughter, Lauren turned towards Grant and asked for recommendations concerning the menu that was placed in front of them. She ordered for them, herself and Brett, from the grinning waiter who had seated them. It was obvious that he still found their little mishap funny. She let her gaze wander across the room, carefully taking in the subtle, opulence of the decor, all the while getting a glimpse into the taste of the man that was seated next to her. It was the silence that broke her observation, and she blushed when she found 3 pairs of eyes watching her. Irritated at being caught off guard, and at the fact that Chase seemed to show no recollection of their previous encounter, she immediately took the lead in getting their meeting underway, to the surprise of Grant. Noticing his faint reaction, she turned on the charm and immediately managed to put him at ease. Grant began a hurried explanation of the reason for this meeting. He focused on the finalization of the paperwork, as well as the financial aspects that needed to be addressed. Their meal arrived, and they continued their discussion in between mouthfuls. She was so engrossed in the urgency of the whole matter that she failed to notice the quiet withdrawal of her daughter Brett, as she seemed to shrink within her chair. Had she done so, she would have realized that Brett had been paying careful attention to their discussion. It was only at the mention of the need to find the elusive Beau and Dinah Mackenzie that Lauren turned quickly towards Brett, but it was too late. At the mention of her parents' name, Brett let out an anguished moan before bursting into heart-wrenching sobs. Lauren immediately lifted her into the safety of her arms, whilst Chase and Grant could only look on in total shock. Sitting with the sobbing child in her lap, she gazed at Chase in desperation. Immediately, he was a ball of energy, taking full control of the situation. Scooping the young girl into his arms, he fired a couple of instructions to a helpless-looking Grant before striding out the dining hall. Lauren all but ran after him. Marching up to an SUV which was parked in the reserved bay, he ushered her in before placing Brett onto her lap. Within minutes, he had them out of the car park and onto the road. Barely a word was passed between them except for his occasional scrutiny through the rearview mirror. The drive seemed to have calmed the hysterical child, and it was only then that Lauren realized that they were driving on unfamiliar roads. "Where are you taking us?" she whispered. "You'll see soon enough," he smiled, turning in his seat to look at them both. Satisfied with what he saw, he refocused his attention on his driving. It wasn't long before he was turning onto a long, winding driveway that was bordered with beautiful, tall palm trees. Neatly tucked in the end was a charming double-story house. Her thoughts began to run riot when an elegant elderly woman stepped out through the opened doors. "Chase! What a lovely surprise! Why on earth didn't you call and—" She stopped mid-sentence, and a look of concern flushed into eyes as green and turbulent as the sea. Those eyes missed nothing as she took in the young woman sitting in the back seat of the car with the whimpering child on her lap. Without a word and with unhurried movements, Chase got out of the vehicle and moved to open the rear door. Reaching in, he gently lifted the young child into his arms and strode into the house and straight upstairs, leaving the two women to scramble in after him. In the chaos of the moment, they managed to introduce themselves to each other. They had barely stepped into the house when they heard a rustling sound at the top of the stairs. Looking up, they watched as Chase made his way down, having shed both his tie and his suit jacket. Needing something to distract her from just the look of him, Lauren turned her attention to the interior of the house. It was breathtaking. There seemed to be a sense of absolute balance that flowed from the outside to within the inside in perfect harmony. Realization kicked in, and with a feeling of intense guilt, she turned to him with questioning eyes. "Brett," she began. "Is sleeping," Chase finished, with a knowing smile in his eyes. "She's quite safe here, so you need not worry about her too much. Chances are she's going to sleep out her fears for a while." Turning his attention to the older woman, he enfolded her in a loving embrace as she gently kissed his cheeks. "Mama, I'm so sorry for the intrusion, but I knew that you would understand. It was the first place I thought of to bring the little child. Anyway, I'd like you to meet Lauren Dene. Lauren, this is my mother, Marie." "We've already introduced ourselves, my dear boy." Marie looked at her with speculation, taking in everything. Her gaze softened as she noted the strained, almost agitated look on the young woman. Quickly, she gave her a comforting hug. "So you are the woman my son has been talking about. I have heard so much about you that I feel as if I already know you." She smiled warmly. Taking Lauren by the arm, she steered her towards a peaceful-looking sunroom situated just off the foyer and towards a comfortable sofa. "Now, why don't you tell me about the little one, whilst Chase fetches us some refreshments?" she ordered. From the manner in which he immediately responded to her request, it was obvious that she was still regarded as a figure of authority. Lauren wasn't quite sure whether it was just the tranquility of the room or the gentleness of a host that had her pouring out her heart to her. She felt such peace being in the presence of the observant Marie that she could almost feel every single limb start to relax in a manner that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She barely noticed when the refreshments were brought in, or when a cup of soothing tea was placed in her hands. She didn't even catch the look that passed between mother and son, or even when he quietly left the room. There was just the stillness in Marie that made her feel comfortable, and more importantly, safe. The only thing she couldn't bring herself to reveal was Chase's contribution to the woes of her young ward. Time literally seemed to have raced by, and she was surprised when the housekeeper entered to announce dinner. Again, with that air of gentleness about her, Marie directed her upstairs under the escort of her son. It was only when she was safely shut in the ensuite of a lovely rose-pink room that she allowed herself to reflect on Marie. she quickly concluded that Marie was every bit as charming as her son, with the same good looks, and that they both possessed the exact same color of eyes. Hurriedly, she washed her hands and her face as she tried to reach for the towel with closed eyes. She started as one was placed in her hands. Her eyes flew open in surprise as she jerked upright to gaze into the mirror. In it, she was able to see a reflection of Chase casually sitting on the edge of the bathtub. It was only then that she realized that she had not locked the door. It dawned on her that he had no intention of leaving. She tried to ignore his presence as she continued to freshen up, aware that he was watching her every move. She brushed her hair and then applied fresh lipstick before turning around to face him. This proved to be a fatal mistake in that it brought her closer to him. She could barely breathe. Chase allowed his gaze to slowly sweep over her until they finally rested on those painted lips that were soft and inviting. He reached out and gently ran his fingers over her face, and then bent and captured her lips with his. The intensity of emotions that flared up between them was instant and shocking, and it was in that moment that he realized that he needed her respect more than just this moment of pleasurable weakness. It was only his self-discipline that allowed him to step back out of their embrace. Gently, he placed a kiss on the palm of her hand and then strode out the room. Lauren sank down onto the edge of the recently vacated tub as she tried to gain control of her senses. Switching to mechanical mode, which had always worked for her, she was able to make herself presentable before stepping out to join the waiting Chase in the hallway. Stopping only to peek in on the still sleeping Brett, they silently made their way downstairs to the dining room and the already seated Marie. Dinner was lovely, if not a little strained, and Marie proved to be a welcomed distraction. It was all too much for Lauren, who, as soon as dinner was over, pleaded tiredness and escaped to the safety of the room in which her daughter lay. There on the bed lay a pretty nightdress and gown, and a note attached to it requesting her to leave her decidedly crumpled clothing outside in the laundry basket. Feeling decidedly relaxed after a long soak and in clean clothes, she climbed into bed and allowed sleep to wash over her. Beautiful by Roseann Ezra, Chapter 3. But you must not forget this one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years like a day. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. The new morning dawned bright and early, and as Lauren gazed out across the neatly manicured gardens, she realized that she could get used to enjoying life of such exquisite bliss. Everything about her in the setting was peaceful and serene, and with a groan, she knew that she had to return to her mundane world of psychological chaos. After a quick shower, she went in search of her hostess, Marie. She was pleasantly surprised to see young Brett in her company and wearing a happy smile. Chase was also with them, looking extremely immaculate and almost ready to leave for the day. "Do you think that you could give us a ride home? I really need to get to the office today." She trailed off as Brett glared at her unhappily. She quickly walked over, knelt down beside the forlorn figure in the wheelchair, and began to gently explain the importance of being at work. She spoke of the new kid that was coming in to see her, and judging from her case file, it was important that she be there to listen to this child. Brett seemed to shrink deeper into the chair, and Marie was quick to notice this. Offering a hand to the still kneeling young woman to help her up, she comfortingly patted her shoulder. "I just had a brilliant idea. Why don't you go home and pack a bag for Brett and yourself? When your day is done, you can drive straight over and stay for a couple of days or until Brett is ready to go home." Lauren stared at the kindness on the older woman's face and quickly looked away, quite unable to speak. "Marie, are you sure?" The older woman gave her a reassuring smile. "I think Brett and I will enjoy some quality girly time together. And anyway, I've already arranged for my own personal family doctor to come and have a look at Brett. I hope that's okay with you, Lauren," she hurriedly inquired. Before Lauren could voice her thoughts or concerns, Chase stepped into the conversation for the first time that morning. "I think that is a brilliant plan." He smiled at his mom whilst grasping Lauren's arm and steering her in the direction of the front door. "We really need to leave now if we want to miss the morning traffic," he emphasized. Lauren quickly stepped out of his grasp and hurried back to the two women. Quickly she hugged her daughter and then turned to hug the older woman with all the love and gratitude she could convey in one simple action. She hurried back to the man who stood patiently waiting for her before her emotions could overwhelm her. In her desperation to quell the tears that welled up, she totally missed the tender, almost protective look that flickered across that gorgeous face which swam in front of her. The drive home was done in total silence, with both occupants totally preoccupied with their thoughts. Strangely enough, though, each of them was hypnotically conscious of the other. Pulling up to the front door, Chase mumbled a hasty goodbye before driving off without even a backward glance. That day was proving to be an incredibly long and warm one. And though she was dressed in a pale yellow silk sleeveless top and skirt, Lauren's mood was in no way as sunny as her clothing. Her new patient was giving her an extremely hard time. She was barely 10 years old and was ridden with so much hurt and guilt that an average adult would have buckled under the pressure of such a load to the point of murder or even suicide. Lauren was seething on the inside, even though her expression was blank and serene. How could some parents be so cruel and abusive to their very own children, and in the most horrid ways possible? Feeling utterly emotionally drained, Lauren knew that she had to get away from the office and to a place of quiet where she could think clearly without getting emotionally tangled. She was furious at the adult population. Grabbing her bag, she made a beeline for the exit after a few hurried words to her secretary. Hurrying to her car, she quickly dumped her bag and her files into the trunk before climbing into the driver's seat. She drove aimlessly for a while until she found herself making her way up the long winding driveway to Marie's house. Parking outside under the shade of a tree, she made no move to climb out, pondering on whether it was a wise decision to come here, especially when she was in a mental turmoil over what had unfolded in her office. She needed to think. She needed a clear head, but above everything else, she needed to be close to Brett right now. Feeling suddenly overwhelmed, she rested her forehead against the solidness of the steering wheel in an effort to gain control over her emotions. She was unaware of the figure that was slowly walking towards her. She jerked up in shock as the door popped open, staring up into Chase's face. She stifled the furious words that came to her lips as she noticed the look of concern on his face as his eyes searched hers. Without saying anything, he gently helped her out of the car and silently walked her into the house and into a different room than the one that she had used. Silently, she studied the breathtaking simplicity of the room. The colors were light and serene. It contained a huge bed and a writing desk with built-in wardrobes. It was the bathroom that captured her full attention. There was a beautiful sunken corner bath, a shower stall, as well as a beautiful granite counter which housed the hand basin. On it stood toiletries and a beautiful vase of flowers. Large scented candles surrounded the bath. Without a moment's hesitation, she lit every single one of those candles whilst filling the bath. Pouring into the water some deliciously perfumed bubbles, she hastily stripped off her clothes before slipping into the scented water. May integrity and uprightness protect me, because my hope is in you. Psalm chapter 25, verse 21. As he made his way downstairs, Chase tried to understand the look that he had seen in Lauren's eyes. The hurt and the confusion had been so transparent that all he wanted to do was wrap her in his arms and protect her from whatever it was that was causing her such distress. Judging from the spark that suddenly flared in her eyes, he knew that she was not ready to let him into her confidence. She had some talking to do, especially as to why she was pretending to be the mother to that sweet kid that was trapped in that awful contraption of a wheelchair. Sighing deeply, he made his way out to the garden to where his mom was happily chatting with an almost transformed Brett. Gone was that haunted look that normally graced her face, and instead there was a relaxed happiness that made her quite beautiful. He had an awful day and a dinner engagement that he was not looking forward to, so this transformation in Brett was exactly what he needed in lifting his spirit. Lauren lazily finished in the bathroom and changed into a pair of shorts and t-shirt. Slipping her feet into a pair of sandals, she hastily tidied the mess that she had made in her room and quickly hurried downstairs. Pausing at the entrance of the garden, she allowed her gaze to slowly drift over each one of them individually. She felt a mounting sense of love and deep affection well up within her. It was that emotion of love which sent her into a tailspin of fear and panic. Quickly subduing all anxieties, she plastered a smile onto her face and gaily strode out toward them. Brett was the first to see her. "Mummy!" she shrieked out delightedly, whilst holding her arms to her. Hugging her close, Lauren felt an overwhelming sense of protectiveness sweep over her, and she knew in that instant that despite the growing attraction, she was beginning to feel for Chase. She would do everything in her power to protect this little defenseless girl. She was now her mother and was beginning to view herself as just that. Slipping onto one of the scattered cushions that lay on the rug on the grass, she quickly slotted herself as Brett's helper in the word game Scrabble. Amidst gentle teasing and laughter, Chase found himself totally engrossed in the game that he totally forgot about his dinner date. And so preoccupied was he that he failed to notice the lovely blonde who stood in the shadow of one of the pillars that flanked the entrance to the garden. Feeling suddenly unsettled and conscious of being watched, Lauren quickly looked up and inhaled sharply as she noticed the young woman staring at all of them, at her in particular, with a look of pure animosity which distorted the beauty of the woman's face. On hearing the sharp intake of her breath, the other three people also looked up. "Damn," muttered Marie, as she gazed impatiently at her son. Before she could respond to her questioning look, a high-pitched, almost plaintive voice called out towards them. "Darling," she breathed, "aren't you going to introduce me to your guests? I guess I have found the reason for you forgetting our dinner date." She laughed, although her smile didn't even reach her eyes. Marie, being the ever-gracious host, quickly rose to her feet and hurried forward to meet the newcomer. "Amanda, my dear, I really didn't expect to see you here again, and so soon. Please forgive my son. He does tend to forget mentioning these tiny bits of information to me. Oh, well, now that you're here, why don't you join us and meet our friends who are staying with us for a couple of weeks?" murmured Marie. A wicked look of merriment lit her eyes as she glanced over to the still-seated trio. Ducking her head, Lauren stifled a chuckle that welled up and ended up choking instead. Chase hastily pounded her back in an effort to soothe and reprimand her. Lauren scrambled to her feet in an effort to get away from him and found herself trapped in Marie's grasp. "Amanda, may I present Dr. Lauren Deney? Lauren, my darling girl, this is one of Chase's girlfriends." Focusing her attention once again on the now seething Amanda, she went on to elaborate just how wonderful it was to have company, especially someone charming and witty. Marie went on to rave just how happy she was with young Brett and how attentive Chase was to both of them. She smiled innocently when her son glared at her with impatience and a hint of annoyance, only to have him shout with laughter as she glared right back. Still laughing at his mother's antics, he bent over the young bewildered girl and scooped her into his arms. Glaring at Marie and Lauren with mock irritation, he informed both of them that he was going to shower and change, and that they would be dining without him. Turning around to walk indoors, he missed the look of victory that Amanda tossed at Lauren as she seated herself with the grace of a preening peacock. Marie, however, missed nothing. Not wanting to remain in the company of this catty woman, Lauren quickly excused herself and hurriedly made her way upstairs to check on Brett. She found the young girl playing happily in the bathtub under the watchful eye of Ellen, the helper, who stood alongside the tub with an armful of towels. "Please, madame, would you be so kind as to take them to Master Chase whilst I finish up with the young missy?" Before Lauren could even respond, she found herself clutching those same towels that were dumped into her hands. Hugging them to her chest, she made her way over to Chase's room and hesitantly knocked on the door. She waited patiently, but after getting no reply, she entered. This room was certainly designed for a man. It spoke of masculinity, with the only color coming from the beige walls, housing an enormous, obviously custom-built bed. It was the sound of the shower stopping that had her hurrying towards the bathroom door. Thinking she could place it on the floor just outside the door, she jumped back in surprise as the door swung open, revealing a highly irritated and dripping wet Chase. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Turning crimson in embarrassment, Lauren all but ran out of the room, with the sound of his mocking laughter chasing after her. Seeking refuge in her room, she paced back and forth as she tried to gain control of her erratic emotions. He was supposed to be her enemy, and yet he seemed to make her feel and think things that she didn't expect to. He truly was breathtaking, she had to admit. With a groan, she stopped in the center of the room, suddenly very conscious of an ever-present presence that seemed to beckon to her. Falling to her knees, she wept before the Lord. It was as if a dam had burst forth as she poured her heart to her Heavenly Father. She told him about all her fears and concerns concerning Amy, her newest patient. She cried out for his healing touch upon Brett. She thanked him for placing Marie as a role model and dear friend in her life. And then she petitioned him for his grace and protection over herself, especially with regards to the riotous feelings that surfaced every time she was around Chase. She stayed on her knees in silent submission until she began to feel all the heaviness of the past few days melting away into nothingness. A feeling of tenderness washed over her, and she knew instantaneously that Abba, her father, was there, leading and directing her. Feeling decidedly calm and collected, she freshened up, retouched her makeup, and prayed that Marie would not quiz her on her puffy eyes. Chase was also fighting his own demons in his room. Having dressed, he made no attempt to leave his room. Reclining on one of the armchairs that overlooked the garden, he reflected on the way his every sense seemed to come alive whenever Lauren was nearby. What he could not understand was that schoolgirl blush that flooded her face whenever he looked at her with any semblance of desire. True, he had dated a lot of women, but recently he found himself seeking God's counsel more and more on the way he treated women as well, as the level of respect that he seemed to show them, knowing with a certainty that he could easily get past Lauren's defenses and maybe even get her to succumb to him physically. He was not sure that he wanted to do that. It struck him that this would just cheapen her, and it was something he was not prepared to do. He liked and respected her too much, and besides, his mother would skin him alive. Taking a few moments, he sought the Lord. He asked for clarity and protection for both himself and Lauren, and willingly left it in the hands of God. Feeling decidedly calm, Lauren decided that it was time to leave the safety of her room. She felt a moment of remorse at having left Marie alone with the unpleasant Amanda. She was just about to descend the stairs when she caught a whiff of familiar scent behind her. Willing herself not to turn around, she slowly made her way down in an effort not to do something silly, like tripping over herself or falling down the stairs. Knowing that sooner or later she would have to face him, she slowed her descent until he was by her side. Amanda is very beautiful. She seems like a very entertaining person. Lauren smiled. Oh, she's entertaining, all right. She is what one would call a woman of the world. She knows how to hold a man's attention and is not afraid of using her sex appeal in holding that attention. I guess at the end of the day, she's quite capable of making a person forget one's self, especially after a hectically stressful day. He winked innocently